What happens when a casual late-night interview turns into a heated confrontation that nobody saw coming? And country music's biggest star walks off set in the middle of live television. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most shocking moments in late-night TV history. Blake Shelton, known for his laid-back personality and quick wit, found himself in a verbal sparring match with Jimmy Kimmel that escalated so quickly even the studio audience didn't know how to react. The tension was building from the very first question. But what pushed Blake over the edge will surprise you. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because this story has more twists than you'd expect. The evening started like any other taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. Blake Shelton walked out to his usual warm reception, that familiar Oklahoma charm radiating as he waved to the crowd. He was there to promote his latest album, and everything seemed perfectly normal as he settled into the guest chair. Jimmy greeted him with his trademark grin. But Blake sensed something off, an edge hiding behind the humor. Jimmy wasted no time diving into the online chatter surrounding Blake's recent comments about artists getting opportunities based on connections rather than hard work. Blake attempted to defuse the moment, but Jimmy kept pressing, his tone sharpening with every sentence. By this point, the audience sensed something was wrong. They were no longer watching fun banter. They were witnessing the first sparks of a confrontation that would soon erupt into chaos. Blake tried to keep his voice calm, reminding Jimmy that he'd been talking about authenticity and earning your place in the industry. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He brought up younger artists, hinted at Blake, throwing shade, and suggested Blake was becoming out of touch. For a moment, Blake blinked, as if trying to process just how aggressively the interview had taken a turn. Then Jimmy pushed harder, questioning Blake's own authenticity, accusing him of following trends, and even pointing out his success, wealth, and marriage to Gwen Stefani as proof he had drifted from his roots. That was the moment Blake's jaw tightened, the point where irritation transformed into real tension. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The air felt heavy, unpredictable. Blake shifted forward, gripping the armrests as he struggled to hold his composure. Jimmy continued poking, almost daring Blake to snap. And as Blake felt his patience draining, the interview that began as a promotional stop was already spiraling into something far more dramatic. What followed next was a slow, uncomfortable unraveling of Blake's calm exterior. Jimmy leaned back as if enjoying the storm he was stirring, casually adding that Blake was pretty far from that Oklahoma boy image he claimed to represent. The studio audience shifted in their seats, feeling the temperature in the room rise. Blake's eyes narrowed, but he still tried to keep the conversation grounded. He insisted that his success didn't erase his past or the journey it took to get there. But Jimmy cut him off again, this time poking fun at Blake's endorsement deals, his role on The Voice, and the so-called brand that surrounded him. At first, Blake met the jabs head-on, his voice level but firmer than before. However, Jimmy wasn't asking questions anymore. He was building a case, stacking comments designed to corner Blake into defensiveness. He pointed out that Blake's recent singles were radio-friendly, implying they were made for chart success rather than honesty. Blake took a breath, visibly struggling to keep the conversation civil. Jimmy watched him like a comedian preparing a punchline. When Jimmy suggested that Blake was hypocritical, something cracked. Blake asked what exactly Jimmy was trying to say. Instead of backing down, Jimmy smirked, insisting the audience deserved authenticity and calling Blake's persona into question. Blake pushed back harder, emphasizing that authenticity wasn't about image but intention, the heart behind the music, the connection to the fans. Yet Jimmy kept twisting his words, turning everything Blake said into another attack. At that point, the interview became a verbal tug-of-war. Blake defended the grind he went through to get where he was, sleeping in his truck, playing to uninterested bar crowds, scraping for every opportunity. Jimmy countered by asking why struggle was necessary for authenticity. Was Blake saying young artists who got famous online didn't deserve their success? Blake tried to explain nuance, but Jimmy seemed determined to trap him. Then came the moment. Jimmy commented that Blake hadn't worked a real job in decades and lived in luxury. That hit hard. The audience gasped. Blake stared at Jimmy, at a complete loss for words. Finally, he replied with a quiet, controlled intensity that stunned the room. He talked about the people he sang for, the single parents, the workers, the farmers, people who found something meaningful in his songs. Jimmy tried brushing it off with sarcasm, but Blake's tone had shifted. This was no longer entertainment or a celebrity interview. This was personal, and by then, everyone watching knew something explosive was coming. As the tension peaked, Blake leaned over Jimmy's desk, his hands planted firmly on the surface. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the tightening muscles in his jaw and the fire in his eyes. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the lights. Even Jimmy's house band, usually quick to add playful background cues, had gone completely still. Jimmy tried regaining control with a forced grin, but Blake's anger was past the point of no return. Blake accused Jimmy of twisting his words, of turning a simple conversation into an ambush. Jimmy tried to justify it as asking the questions everyone was thinking, but even he seemed unsure of himself now. Blake wasn't shouting, his voice was steady, even cold, and that made every word carry twice the weight. He told Jimmy he had come there expecting to talk about music, not defend his character. He reminded Jimmy that authenticity wasn't something that could be granted or revoked by a talk show host. Jimmy tried to recover by calling Blake too sensitive, but the comment only made everything worse. Blake laughed, not joyful laughter, but the kind that comes from disbelief. He called the interview what it had become, a setup designed for entertainment at his expense. Some audience members clapped, breaking the tension for just a moment. That seemed to rattle Jimmy, who warned Blake that walking off the show would get people talking. That's when Blake froze mid-stride, turned back, and asked Jimmy if that was supposed to be a threat. The audience knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. Blake laid out exactly what Jimmy had done, twisting his words, misrepresenting his comments, turning the night into a spectacle. Jimmy attempted to insist he had done nothing wrong, but his voice lacked its usual playful authority. Blake wasn't finished. He explained the irony of Jimmy lecturing him about authenticity, when Jimmy's entire act was a performance crafted for audience applause. He said authenticity was about honesty, and the most honest thing he could do at that moment was refuse to let himself be used as a punching bag. Every word seemed to hit Jimmy harder than the last. By the time Blake unclipped his microphone, dropping it onto Jimmy's desk with a loud crack, the audience collectively held its breath. Blake apologized to them, not to Jimmy, for what they had witnessed. Jimmy tried pleading with him to sit back down, but for the first time all night, the host's voice sounded small. Blake shook his head, taking one final look at the stage that had suddenly become a battleground, rather than a studio. Blake walked toward the edge of the stage, but Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to salvage the moment. He begged Blake to sit, to restart the interview, to talk about the album and tour like they were supposed to. But it was too late. Blake looked back with an expression, caught halfway between sympathy and disappointment. The opportunity for a real conversation had passed long ago. Jimmy had made his choices, and Blake wasn't going to reward them by staying. Blake told Jimmy the time for honesty had been at the start of the show, before the ambush. He pointed out that Jimmy had chosen drama over respect, shock value over sincerity. Every sentence from Blake felt like a final verdict on the night's events. Jimmy, now visibly shaken, tried again to bring up the importance of the show, but Blake wasn't having it. His final words echoed through the studio. This isn't a show anymore. This is real life. And in real life, when someone disrespects you like this, you don't have to sit there and take it. With that, Blake turned and walked off stage. The cameras stayed trained on the empty space he left behind, as if unsure whether they were supposed to follow him or stay put. The band members watched silently, instruments untouched. Some audience members sat frozen. Others whispered to one another in disbelief. A few even applauded Blake's exit. Jimmy remained behind his desk, struggling to piece together a closing remark. His smile, the one he'd used for years to navigate awkward interviews, was nowhere to be found. Instead, he stared down at the desk. At the microphone Blake had dropped like a final punctuation mark. For the first time all night, Jimmy looked genuinely rattled. Producers scrambled just out of camera view, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or attempt to salvage what was left of the segment. The audience waited, uncertain whether the confrontation was truly over or if Blake might somehow return. But he didn't. Blake Shelton had already stepped outside the studio doors, leaving behind the chaos, the cameras, and a host who had pushed him too far. The moment would soon become one of the most talked about meltdowns in late-night history. Clips circulating online, fans debating who was right or wrong, and media outlets dissecting every second of the exchange. Some would defend Jimmy as doing his job. Others would praise Blake for standing up for himself. But one thing was clear. Late-night television had never seen anything quite like it. And as the dust settled over that unforgettable night, audiences everywhere were left asking the same question. Was Blake justified in walking off? Or did Jimmy simply push him past the point of patience?